Hi, I'm Shane Maynard, and I was one of those bad teens. You know, the kind that makes the teacher tense up when they walk in. I was always getting into trouble. I got into fights a lot. Most of them I started, destroyed public property, came to class with my knuckles bleeding, and almost got expelled for what I thought was a hilarious prank involving fake blood and 4 grossed out and upset faculty members. Often, when adults come into contact with a teen who is out of control, their first thought is a judgmental one. They see them as a nuisance and think that teen needs some heavy discipline, a good talking to be put in their place. As a teen, I got that talk from adults many times. And I'm here to tell you, it definitely wasn't what I needed. And it didn't work. It's taken me a long time to figure out why. And today, I'm going to talk about how that perception fuels the cycle of harmful behavior, and how providing safe spaces for self-discovery radically alters the outcome of a teen's life before consequences become a heartbreaking reality. As an adult, I teach personal development through the arts, using painting and poetry, for teens that have extreme behavioral challenges, teens that have done heinous acts of violence. Some of my students are under 24-hour watch and are the kind of teens that other teachers, family members, and even therapists have given up on. But we can't give up on them, and here's why. When someone asks me why this demographic, I tell them it's because I've been in their shoes. I was the bad teen. In high school, I was violent to myself and others. Part of this came from experiencing trauma at an early age. I had parents that loved me, but my upbringing centered around biker gangs and a violent atmosphere. Trying to get a teen who grew up in violence to imagine a world where violence doesn't exist is like asking someone to think of a color they've never seen before. But the major reason I had such a hard time was because my father died unexpectedly. My mother leaned into alcoholism, and we couldn't handle each other's grief. I would go days without sleeping. I had OCD, paranoia, and at one point, during a 5-day-long stretch without sleep, I even thought my own mother was trying to kill me. During all this, I wrote poetry and created art constantly. And as much as I believe that the arts save lives, it hadn't yet saved mine. When I was 16, me and a friend were house sitting for her aunt. Late that night, while music was blaring from MTV in the living room, you know, back when MTV actually played music, I found myself feeling completely overwhelmed. So I went into the bathroom, locked the door, and I hung myself with a belt. My friend heard my feet convulsing against the door, broke it down, and cut me loose, after I had already blacked out and stopped breathing. The years following that suicide attempt weren't any easier. Now, I'm grateful because it put me on the path to become the person I never had growing up. As a teen, I already knew that if I survived, I wanted to work with other teens. I wanted to be the person I never had. You see, I was already labeled bad. So instead of offers for therapy, I got threats to be sent off, locked up. No one ever came to me and asked, "What do you need? How can I help?" And it would have altered everything. I've seen how damaging judgments can be through working with teens, and how often they get punished for their own trauma. Expecting a teen not to lash out in violence when their body is in a constant state of fight or flight can be futile. There's a wonderful book called The Power of the Adolescent Mind that breaks down the science of this. There's a wavelength that goes from the back of the brain to the front, where decision-making happens. Now, in teens, this wavelength of processing moves slow due to their development. But in a teen that has undergone trauma, the wavelength sometimes never makes it to the front. Their bodies are literally captive to their trauma. And I know this to be true because I've lived it. So how do we help them regain control over their bodies? Well, I've made a discovery. Through my own journey and in working with them, I've found that if you provide a safe space so they can empower themselves through their own self-discovery, instead of telling them what they need, it allows them to build new neural pathways that redirect the outbursts into creativity and start their journey to healing. The results are incredible, and it all centers around asking, what do you need? How can I help you find that out? I got to witness those results 4 years ago when I started offering personal development through the arts at a lockdown facility. The students there were intimidating. Classrooms were being destroyed. Teachers were being assaulted. They were understaffed and lacking resources. They hadn't had an art teacher in a while. The last one quit after being assaulted by her students. It's enough to make any facilitator a nervous wreck and go in with bias. But the situations I encountered there were familiar to my own experiences. Students who were in violent outbursts became separated, then punished, with no space or guidance for them to process what was happening. They were being bound by their trauma. They were giving up by giving in to the labels tied to their punishment. The label of a bad teen was being reinforced over and over. They were starting to believe it. Now, I understand that many of you may not be able to get where these teens are coming from. But here's something I think we can all relate to. How many of you have been given advice or encouragement and weren't in a place to receive it? I know I have. You think, they're just being nice, they don't get what I'm going through. And your friend who offered the advice gets upset after the 20th time of trying to save you and says, okay, you want to be miserable? Be miserable. I think we've all been on both sides of that, right? The person who couldn't receive and the annoying friend with good intentions. Well, I was the annoying friend to one of my students when I first started teaching. This student never had anything good to say about herself and was always getting into trouble for fights. She was an incredibly talented artist, but refused to receive any compliments about her art. Every time I would offer her praise, it made her want to throw away what she created even more. One day, we were working on an art piece with the prompt, "Express who you are." She drew herself sitting in a corner with horrible things written about herself on the walls. The words were vulgar, dehumanizing, and shocking. They were so brutal, I was at a loss for words. I mean, here we have this beautiful, talented young lady who thinks of herself in this way. And then I remembered how I thought of myself that same way when I was her age. So instead of asking her to redo the drawing, to say positive things about herself, I asked her, "Where do you think these words are coming from?" Her first response, "I don't know, I just feel that way." I said, okay, and let her be. When everyone left, she came up and said, I've thought about it, where the words come from. My father is in prison for sexual assault. My family doesn't want anything to do with me. I said, I'm so sorry. Then she asks, is it okay if I take some of the art supplies with me? I said, sure. And I gave her one sheet, a few Sharpies, and a watercolor palette. A few weeks later, I'm setting up the space before the students come in, and she walks into the room with that same watercolor paper in her hands and gives it to me. It was the same prompt, express who you are, except this time, she had traced her hand and wrote all these beautiful things about herself. And then I see where she's written the words, my past does not define who I am. I look at her and she smiles. For the first time that year, she smiles. She detached herself from what's been done to her. She did that, not me. All I did was allow her the space to discover what she needed for herself. She freed herself. And that discovery and self-empowerment had a ripple effect. She stayed out of trouble and sought opportunities for her future. I realized in that moment that once teens are given the space to detach themselves from the narrative of their trauma, they gain ownership over their actions, the power to change their outcome. What's even more amazing is not only did I realize it, the rest of the class started realizing it too. Once they saw through each other, it was possible. To a teen, an adult who's already healed from most of their trauma is not as inspiring. But to see each other doing it, that's a hope that spreads like wildfire. They become their own heroes, even in situations where it feels like there's no way out. I've had students in gangs who had charges for robbery, and when you're living in extreme poverty, it can feel like you don't have an option. One of my students last year robbed houses because his mom needed medication and they couldn't afford it. That same year, our class got an opportunity to write and perform a play on incarceration at a theater in Salisbury, North Carolina. When the class started to write the play, he wanted to use his story for the play. He wanted the ending to be harsh. The young man was to be sentenced, life ruined by one mistake. So, that's the ending we wrote. 2 months in, we're rehearsing the ending. He stops in the middle of running his lines, turns to the class, and says, I have to do something. I don't want to end up like this character. I won't. The day before the play, we did a run-through of the show at the theater. He came limping in with broken ribs, his face swollen with a black eye. He got jumped for missing a gang meeting because he chose to do the play instead. And the next night, he did the play proudly in front of a full house with the mayor of Salisbury in attendance. But there was an even more important person in the crowd that night, a teen in the same gang. After, backstage, that teen came up to the manager, asked how to get involved, that he'd do whatever it takes. He saw the transformation happen before his eyes, and because it was someone who was living the same life as him, he believed it was possible. He made the choice to change his outcome. No one can do that for them but themselves. No advice, job opportunities, letters of recommendations are going to make a difference if they don't believe they are worthy of going for it in the first place. Do they need resources? Yes, but they have to be able to accept those resources before they can utilize them. What would have happened to those teens if they would have continued living by the narrative of their past? If there was no space given for them to figure it out for themselves? The idea of that outcome is exactly what's happening in classrooms across this country. So I'm asking you, what if we shifted our narrative from what did you do to what happened to you? If you treat a teen who is in the process of giving up on their life like they are bad, they will act accordingly. When a teen comes to me, I don't ask what they did to be sent here. I ask, who do you want to be? And every time I see a bad behavior, I look for the need, the potential instead of the punishment. I'm Shane Maynor, and I was not a bad teen. Neither are my students.